Let's talk about the perception process. All right, so the model we're going to go over today is the perception process, and there's 6 different parts. So the first part we'll go over is the environmental stimuli, then observation, then perceptual selection, then perceptual organization, then interpretation, and then responses. So let's talk about the environmental stimuli. We're always surrounded by things in our life that are stimulating our senses. So there's certain things that we attune to, but we should note that we are not always in control of our environment, right? Sometimes you go into places that are new, and some places you'll go into are familiar. Now, this can make it so that you really have to adapt to those environmental stimuli, and you tend to notice more environmental stimuli in newer places than in very familiar places. Okay, the way that we observe that environmental stimuli are through our 5 senses. So we might be seeing something that's different, we might be hearing something, we might smell something, we might taste something, or we might feel something. Now, most of us say that we're very visual people, and so you might first be aware of all the visuals in the room, and you might start to try to make sense of all of those. You might have good or bad hearing, and so it's maybe easier to misinterpret or make faulty observations of places due to poor hearing. And we often mishear people say things. We can also have a great sense of smell. And this is something that's really under talked about in our everyday life. But a lot of how we're attracted to people, a lot of how we know if a place is good to eat at or not is based on its smell, right? Does it smell familiar? Does it smell appetizing? All of those things. But also, we might have very strong memories that we're not even really aware of that are connected to our sense of smell. Our sense of taste is really interesting too because when we taste something that's familiar, then we tend to taste it a little bit more. We tend to have different associations with different taste. So if there was maybe a candy that you had in your childhood and you taste it as an adult, it may be bringing back memories of your childhood. And then, of course, feel the way that we feel things even internally and externally is something that you want to think about. So sometimes we feel things and we're like, oh, that's hot, that's cold. Very obvious interpretations from our senses. But we might be feeling something like, oh, my stomach feels upset. What does that mean? Let me just observe this in this moment. All right, the other thing is perceptual selection. So we are sensing all these things. We may think that we have stronger senses than others, and we do, but that doesn't mean that our other senses aren't active. Unless you have something that is actually wrong with some of those senses, all of your senses should be firing. It's just what we're attuning to. So, this is called perceptual selection. So, we have these external factors such as the intensity, the size, the content, the repetition, the motion, the novelty, and the familiarity. So these are all things that, hey, we recognize that we pay more attention to these things. So maybe if they're more familiar, then we don't pay as much attention to it. Or maybe if there's some novelty, we pay attention to it. We're like, I've never seen that before. What is this thing? Also, it might be something like the intensity, so how strong we are sensing that thing. So, if we have a really upset stomach, we're going to be very attuned to that as opposed to, oh, yeah, I don't feel quite right in this situation. So, that's something for you to think about. Also, there's these other factors such as learning, expectations, motivation, personality. So, these are the ways that we're selecting our information. So, the way that we've learned to interpret this information or be aware of this information. If it's happening a lot, then we may be like, huh, I didn't notice it the first time, but now it seems like a pattern with this person, and I'm going to start to recognize it. Also, our own motivation for recognizing these things. So, do we recognize more things that bother us or more things that bring us joy. That might be some of the motivations. And then our personality. So, how aware are you as a person may actually influence your perceptual selection. Okay, the perceptual organization. So, this is also pretty interesting to think about, but we tend to group things together to try to make sense of it. Do we see patterns? And we're always searching for patterns in our lives subconsciously. So, it might be this pattern is very similar to something that happened to me before. So, for instance, when your new partner starts acting in a similar way to your ex, you might have this weird organization that goes on internally, and you're like, ah, they're acting like my ex. Let me just organize it into that category. And now I'm hyper aware of their actions because it seems very similar to this other person. We might also see that we want to think about these perceptions and what makes things seem a little bit more complete or familiar in these different ways. So, what ways does it fit into our already biased perception? We might also try to make it uniform. So this thing is equivalent to this thing. So oftentimes we make weird organizations in our head that may not be right, right? We're always trying to make metaphors in life or make things familiar even when they're not that similar. So we may go, this situation is similar to my own situation. And that may be true, or sometimes it's our brain tricking us to try to organize things. We might also try to make it so that it actually follows a pattern and seems like one thing comes after another. So we're always looking for causes of different things that are happening in our life. It gives us a sense of control when we think of things causing another thing rather than random chaos. And so this also can be good or bad. It helps us organize things, but it may also help us make faulty assumptions and think, oh, this thing definitely caused this other thing to happen. We also try to make things complete. So we try to make it so that we think that we know the full story at every moment, right? We're trying to get every perspective. And what point you consider it the end perspective is actually a lot of your personality and how much you're an investigator. So you may feel like, oh, yes, I know the complete story after hearing 30 seconds into somebody telling you something. Or you might want to know these ins and outs or try to make it complete in your head. You might also think about this in the different kind of comparisons and groupings that things belong to, the categories that you already have inside your mind. All right, so that was perceptual organization. So let's get into interpretation. Now, this is when we get into a lot of those faulty interpretations that I want you to really be aware of. So we have internal and external, we have stable and predictable. And so when we're interpreting this information, a lot of times we go to, hey, that's an internal factor like personality traits, or that's an external factor like environmental cause. This is something that's different that's happening. Now, in an internal way of thinking about something, you might think about it as somebody's ability. And this would be a very stable thing. This is an ongoing something that you think sticks with a person. With the internal thing being unstable, that means that you think that it's a day to day change, and it's how much effort they're putting in, or how much maybe they care about a certain situation. With the external factor, the stable would be how difficult is the task in general. So it's very stable, but it's external from the person's own control. Or you might go, it's very unstable and it's something like luck or chance that something happened. Now, most of the time we have a halo and horns effect, but we also have an internal attribution error. In general, we tend to think of other people going through things as very much external from themselves. So, thinking about this, if somebody does a good thing, in their life and you like the person, you tend to have a halo effect error and you overly emphasize the internal attributions of the person. Oh, they're a good person. That's why they did this good thing. And you dismiss some of the external factors. When you don't like a person and they do something good, you say that it's luck and they just happen to get that thing right. Oh, they just happen to do that job well. Just a fluke. And when somebody does something wrong, this is the horns effect, is that's when you're overly attributing it to the internal factors being there's something wrong with them and that they are an evil person, they're a bad person. And when they do something good, then you think of it as, again, just these external factors that it must have been luck, everything like that. When they do something wrong, it's definitely their internal capability. And so this is an error. You should consider multiple sides and note which one's possible. Also, when you're thinking about your own interpretation of your own actions, this may be very based on your self esteem, what you factor things in more. So, people with higher self esteem maybe account for a little bit more of the internal interpretation. Hey, I worked really hard on this, I put in a lot of effort, and so that's why I ended up doing this thing well. People with lower self esteem a lot of times will say that something was external to themselves. Oh, it's just a fluke. That's why I got that thing right. And that's why I was successful at this point in my life. If you do something wrong, people with high self esteem will usually overly put it into the external factor. Oh, something must have gone wrong. I don't know what happened. Um, Maybe it was this. Maybe I was tired. All of those kind of things. Or maybe it wasn't explained as well. People that make an error and they have low self esteem usually internalize it a lot more. So they go, oh, I'm such a failure. God, I really didn't know why I did that thing. So these are some things for you to think about for your own interpretation and possible biases. All right. And there are all different types of responses that you can have to these interpretations, to these stimuli. But most obviously, there's covert and overt responses. And you might have heard about this recently when thinking about racism, that there's overt and covert white supremacy. So, this is one way that you could interpret it if something was maybe a perceptual bias that people have towards racism. Now, overt would be the very obvious displays, saying things, doing things that people can all observe and see. Maybe you're very forefront in your response. There's also covert things where it's maybe your internal mindset and you're locking that way into your perceptual bias. Maybe in this case of racism, it's different hiring practices, it's internal ways of interpreting different races and everything. So, this overt covert maybe give you a concrete way of thinking about it, especially for biased perceptions. But all of these responses you want to think about in your own life and how do you act overtly and covertly. All right, so that was our section on the perception process.